morning. Thank you. It's great to be down here in Florida when it's not too hot and humid. Thank you for your hospitality here in Orlando. As Mike mentioned, my handout is there in the back. You will want that because I do have a number of quotes there, and just the main outline will help you track with what I will be saying. I'm going to start here by reading from the biblical text. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish here with hunger. I will arise and go to my father." Those lines, of course, come from one of Jesus' most famous parables, the parable of the prodigal son. It has been it has been used to address everything from true repentance to the perils of self-righteousness to the lavish love of God. Well, in book 11, chapter 28 of City of God, however, Augustine refers to the prodigal in order to teach us something about the very structure of creation. The story possesses a narrative form, a deep theology that not only takes in the structure of creation, but even deeper, if I can put it this way informally, the very structure of God. These are related, the structure of creation and the structure of God. Indeed, the structure of creation reveals its origin in God and provides the contours for a return to its source. Furthermore, creation's source has left such traces, or you see that in my title, or footprints. These are both translations of Augustine's Latin vestigia, and I'll be using them interchangeably throughout this paper. So he has left such traces or footprints that its return is not framed with abstract gestures, but is a return in the Spirit through the Son to the Father. To put it more directly, according to Augustine, creation's source is Trinitarian. Creation itself reflects Trinitarian realities. Creation's return to its source will travel a Trinitarian pathway. The key passage that we are reflecting on in this talk is from Book 11, chapter 28, already referenced, which serves as a sort of trailhead as we investigate the Trinity in creation. It's there in your handout. It reads thus: "As we run through the things that God has made in such marvelous stability, then let us gather up or collect the traces of himself that he left more deeply impressed in some places, less deeply in others. And in contemplating his image in ourselves, let us, like the younger son in the gospel, come to ourselves and get up and return to the one from whom we departed by sinning. There our existence will have no death. There our knowledge will have no error. There our love will have no obstacle." Now, the intention of this talk is to draw out the significance of this profound passage for connecting the Trinity to creation and creation to the Trinity. But along the way, I want to stir us up to become better readers. After all, at the core of the Paideia Center for Theological Discipleship is the conviction that reading is at the heart of discipleship. In the Paideia reading group spread now throughout the world, as Mike mentioned, we stir one another up in order to become better readers of classical theological texts. Believing and engaging in this exercise together disciples us into the wisdom, the sapientia of Christ. So through considering some specific themes here in City of God, Book 11, I intend for us to become, number one, better readers of Augustine, number two, better readers of creation, and number three, and very briefly at the end, better readers of God. So first, better readers of Augustine. City of God is not necessarily the first place one goes to in Augustine on the topics of Trinity and creation. After all, he wrote a pretty famous book with Trinity in the name on the Trinity, and also a few on Genesis and creation. But it would be a mistake to think one should only go to those works on those topics. Furthermore, it would be a mistake, as has unfortunately often been practiced, to read one text of Augustine in isolation from the rest of his writings, or even, as frequently found in readers of philosophy and theology and even psychology, to read bits of a work in isolation from the rest of that work. For decades in the 20th century, the latter half of On the Trinity was the victim of this kind of reading, as was even the latter books of the Confessions, much to the detriment of understanding in both cases. Thankfully, recent Augustine scholarship has aimed and succeeded in bringing more historical and doctrinal context for the Bishop of Hippo's writings. On the doctrine of the Trinity, this has meant stressing the need to read all of the relevant Trinitarian writings within Augustine's corpus. Nothing, including chapters on the Trinity, should be read in isolation. This would only lead to another long series of misunderstandings. Scholars such as Louis Ayres, John Cavadini, Luigi Gioia, Roland Williams, they have been some of the most meticulous, deliberately going outside on the Trinity and showing how Augustine wrote on the doctrine of the Trinity in a variety of literary contexts to a variety or diverse audiences. Now, at first blush, this might sound like it would complexify Augustine's teaching on the Trinity, but I actually think the opposite is the case. For one could argue that Augustine speaks more simply and more clearly on the Trinity in places like his tractates on the Gospel of John or City of God than in his famous work with Trinity in the title. If I may be so bold to say, reading Augustine on the Trinity outside of On the Trinity brings greater understanding to what precisely he taught on the Trinity. What is more, it provides lucidity to interpreting a complex, drawn out, and at times experimental text like On the Trinity. If we were to canvass the room for those that have attempted to read on the Trinity, how do you make it through books 8 to 15, and where do you stop and start and stop and start? It can be a challenging read, and it can be befuddling sometimes to know exactly where he's going. On the Trinity, we must admit, is not a scholastic treatise with very precise language that is meticulously defined. Rather, in its experimental character, it at times uses vague language, contains many abandoned strands of argumentation, and to no surprise, has been regularly misread. Outside of their common authorship, what argument can be made for reading City of God and On the Trinity in light of one another? For one, they contain significant overlapping material and were written in the same mature period of his life, including in overlapping years in the second decade of the 5th century. We see this interrelationship, especially in a place like City of God, Book 11, when in the course of the whole work's argument, Augustine is beginning his more positive exposition of the Christian faith. A careful study of the sequence of topics taken in this book, Book 11, shows they map onto the sequence of topics Augustine spreads out more elaborately in the 15 books of On the Trinity. Augustine himself connects the two treatises by cross-referencing City of God in On the Trinity, Book 13, Chapter 12. As John Cavadini has noted, though, City of God's audience is unique in that it is intended for a mixed audience of those along either side of the border of Christian faith. Perhaps this is the reason his logic is more apparent. Perhaps we could even maybe say it's more lucid as he seeks to distinguish Christian from pagan belief. Becoming aware of the variety of literary contexts where Augustine addressed doctrinal topics helps us become better readers of the North African theologian, because we learn he didn't put all his doctrinal eggs in one literary basket. That is to say, the fact that he took up the doctrine of the Trinity in places other than his work on the Trinity, such as in strategic places of the City of God, highlights that it is a core doctrine for him, which integrates and coordinates many other areas of his thought. This is especially the case for the intertwined topics of God's work and God the Trinity. Furthermore, like Peter said of Paul, Augustine wrote some things that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist, 2 Peter 3:16. Becoming more aware of the variety of passages where Augustine addressed a topic will enable the clearer passages to shed interpretive light on those that are harder to understand. I would argue, for example, given when it was written in relation to On the Trinity, City of God 11 provides a refined key to understanding the more extended webs of argumentation which one finds in On the Trinity 8 to 15 in particular. We turn now more directly to covering the topics of creation and God. And we're going to spend the bulk of our time here on this second point, becoming better readers of creation, primarily through City of God, Book 11. Now, in turning to creation, the first thing we note, before even looking to the Trinity's work in creation, is that Augustine was accustomed to thinking in terms of spiritual realities being revealed in the world. Consider the two cities themselves, which serve as, the spine of argumentation for City of God. These cities are fundamentally spiritual realities defined by their allegiance and love either to God or to oneself. In other words, they are defined by worship. As Augustine makes clear early in Book 11, the origin of these cities, which course through this world and which can be observed in this world, their origin is not in this world. Rather, their respective origins are found in the spiritual realm. The heavenly city finds its origin among the holy angels, find that Book 11, chapter 9, and the earthly city finds its origin in fallen angels. What is more, they have destinies that outstrip this present world. The city of God finding its telos in the beatific vision, and the city of man or earthly city meaning its end in the eternal judgment of hell. Thus, the very structure and argument of City of God reveals an author who reflects on present realities, both backward into origin and forward into goal. If this is the case with the distinct study of the two cities, it is all the more the case here with creation. It appears one of Augustine's definite goals in Book 11 is that we would not simply know God's works in themselves, sort of like on a granular level, but that we would be able to trace God's work in creation back to its origin and from there to its goal. The ability to do this is what would make us better readers of creation. But before we consider creation's readership, we must examine how tracing creation's source is fundamentally a question of worship. Augustine famously found a lot of common ground with Platonists, including with their doctrine of creation. But their vision of God the Creator and his act of creation, that's the Platonists, is at best cloudy. Their ambivalence about the body is particularly problematic for Augustine in light of the Lord's incarnation. But the fundamental problem, as Augustine highlights again and again in the City of God, is one of worship. In City of God Book 12, chapter 25, Augustine highlights how within the Platonic framework, lesser gods created by the supreme God are creators of all mortal creatures who in turn offer rites and sacrifices to such gods as if those were their creators. Augustine cut to the chase in his judgment when he wrote, it's there in your handout, "For it is an abomination to believe or say, even before we can understand why, that any God but God alone is the creator of any nature, no matter how minor or mortal. As for angels, whom these philosophers prefer to call gods, we no more call them the creators of living things than we call farmers the creators of crops and trees." For Augustine, the correct view of who creates leads to proper worship. An incorrect view of who creates leads to improper worship. If we believe lesser gods created this world, we will be led to worship them. The result of improperly sourcing creation, therefore, is idolatry. Thus, in order for our worship to be true and edifying to the soul, it must rightly consider creation's true source. To sum up so far, we see Augustine was accustomed to thinking in terms of spiritual realities manifesting themselves in creation. What's more, a right consideration of what spiritual reality stands behind this world, indeed, even created this world, will shape our worship. For Augustine, the one true God directly created this world, and this one true God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. As we saw in Book 11, 28, the triune God has left traces or footprints of himself in his creation. He says something similar just a few chapters earlier in Book 11 in chapter 24, he stated that careful reasoning leads to finding the Trinity intimated to us in God's works, as if by a veiled mode of speech, or he's saying they're expressed enigmatically, a mode intended to exercise our mind's attention. Not surprisingly here, Augustine is saying that the Creator has communicated something of himself in his works, yet he is saying specifically that that is the Trinity. Indeed, a few lines later, we are told that the whole Trinity is intimated to us in its works. And this intimation has a purpose, according to Augustine. It is to exercise us. We might say it's to prompt us. It's to draw us out. It's to stir us to consider from whence we came. Now, Augustine goes on in 11:24 to say that we ask of anything that has been created three things. We ask of anything that's been created three things. Who made it? By what means did he make it? And why did he make it? Who, by what, and why? And this is where things get fascinating. On the one hand, these questions emerge from a threefold classification of philosophy attributed to Plato. On the other hand, there's no claim by Augustine that Platonists have knowledge of the Trinity, quite the opposite. Rather, these questions are what we naturally ask of anything made. In the case of this world, asking these questions reveals for Augustine a threefold causality. Reflected in creation is the Father, the who, speaking of all things in the Word, the by what, and the Spirit is the goodness for the sake of which all was made, the why. Augustine recapitulates these three questions at the end of Book 11:24 when speaking about the heavenly city. To quote Augustine, if we ask, how does it come to be? God founded it. If we ask, how does it come to be wise? It is illumined by God. If we ask, how does it come to be happy? It enjoys God. It is defined by subsisting in God. It is illumined by contemplating God. It is made joyful by clinging to God. It is, it sees, it loves. It finds its strength in God's eternity, its light in God's truth, its joy in God's goodness. These questions demonstrate the purpose of looking for the Trinity in creation. It is to exercise our contemplation. Through the Trinity establishing footprints in creation, there is an intelligibility that exercises our contemplation in order that we might, from creation, consider God. But Augustine is at pains to make clear there is no mirror in creation of the Trinity. There's no proportional comparison between creator and creation. There are rather enigmatic hints, traces, which we have as their very intention and invitation to our persistent attention. Fittingly, in Augustine's sequence of thought in Book 11, he moves from this pattern of knowing creation to his famous distinction between use and enjoyment, famously in Latin, uti and frui. He uses this elsewhere in his writings. In 11:25, he states, fruit has nothing to do with enjoying something, while use has to do with using something. And the difference between them seems to be this. We are to enjoy something when it delights us in its own right without reference to some further end, while we are said to use something when we seek it for the sake of some further end. Thus, we ought to use rather than to enjoy temporal things so that we might deserve to enjoy eternal things. Now, clearly for Augustine, the purpose of these traces or footprints of the Trinity is not that we might be enamored with them, that we would be enthralled with them as ends in themselves. No, the traces in creation are to be used to some other end, namely to move us toward God. In short, their purpose is conversion, being drawn and transformed into the one that created us. But before we consider the spiritual ends of our consideration of creation, we must pick up one crucial nuance Augustine makes that is found in that section quoted earlier at the beginning from Book 11, chapter 28. While God has left traces or footprints of himself in his work of creation, Augustine notes these footprints are heavier or more defined in some areas of his work than in others. What he primarily has in mind here is the image of God in humanity. All creatures share some likeness by virtue of being created, some likeness to God as their source. But humanity is closest to God due to being in his image. Augustine explains in Book 11, chapter 26, we recognize in ourselves, Augustine says, an image of God, that is the supreme Trinity. It is not equal to God, but rather falls far short of him. Nor is it co-eternal with God. Nor, to put the whole matter briefly, is it of the same substance of God. There is nothing else, however, among all the things made by God that is closer to him by nature, even though it still needs to be reformed and perfected in order to be nearest to him in likeness as well. For we exist, and we know we exist, and we love both this existence and this knowledge. Now, in context addressing Nicene principles of Trinitarian theology, Augustine will speak about the image as equal with God because he's speaking about the Son. Here it's clear he doesn't mean that. This is a similitudo that humanity shares with its creator, but this similitude is utterly unique from the rest of God's works. I want to highlight two things he says here about the unique status of the image among God's work. First, the image is dynamic in relation to its origin and goal. And second, that he speaks about it in ways that very much overlap with his thought in the book on the Trinity. It's dynamic in relation to its origin and goal, and there's overlapping content here with On the Trinity. In On the Trinity, Book 7, chapter 12, Augustine summarizes the key feature of the image as dynamic in humanity when he said this: it is image in such a way as to be to the image. In Latin, this to the image is the preposition ad, ad, meaning to or towards, plus the accusative form of image. To be in the image of the Trinity is to be constituted as toward the Trinity. The image's dynamic sense does not come from our need for renewal in light of sin, though that need is within us for certain, but in Augustine it comes from the very doctrine of creation. As Joya put it, one of the authors I referred to earlier, the image is not something equal to God in us, which can be calmly possessed and enjoyed, but rather something that sets us in motion. This can be explained in light of the created image establishing a relation. In his unfinished On the Literal Interpretation of Genesis, Augustine wrote, "Every image is like that of which it is an image. Every image is like that of which it is an image. But not everything which is like something is also its image. Thus, because in a mirror or in a picture there are images, they are also like. But if the one does not have its origin from the other, it is not said to be the image of the other. For it is an image only when it is derived from the other thing." For Augustine, image is above all a category of relation. It is not something we are handed that we then manage in isolation from its source. Through it, we have an immediate link with God. We have a Trinitarian relation of origin and end between us and our Creator. So much past modern scholarship on the image of God in Augustine, particularly that which sought to plumb the depths of On the Trinity, books 8 to 15, sought to explain how through the image we are like God. And this is to miss Augustine's point entirely. A careful reading of On the Trinity bears this out. According to Augustine in On the Trinity, human beings do not just happen to mirror certain aspects of divine things. In fact, if one is looking at Augustine's famous psychological image in human beings, the memory, intellect, will, without its relation to God, then one is not truly looking at the image of God, since the image is not simply the mind's self-relatedness. One cannot image God by being a contained object to itself. Think of the prodigal, which we opened with. He sought to take that which was from his father and then live in isolation from his father. Such a move leads us to, in Rowan Williams' words, the fantasy of being a self-subsistent agent. The prodigal's fantasy only put him on the road to his destruction, eating pods in a pen of pigs. The abundant life of the prodigal was dependent on his relation to his source and returning to his loving source, his Father. Truly living according to our image is like the prodigal, acknowledging ourselves as loved creatures and returning to our Father. In yielding to the loving Creator and Redeemer, we realize that we are relative beings who fulfill our createdness, not by seeing ourselves more clearly, but by seeing ourselves in relation to God and receiving participation in his life. How this is made possible is contingent on the grace of God and his outward movement from the divine to the human in the Son and in the Spirit. Well, this paper is about the Trinity and creation and how the Trinity leaves traces or footprints in creation. Augustine states there is a spiritual purpose behind the divine tracks in creation. Indeed, perhaps the translation footprints is preferred, that translation of vestigia, because their purpose is that we might track or follow them. Just as we might follow footprints in the ground as we try to find our way to some destination. Footprints are not to be studied in and of themselves. They are to be followed. Creation has a source in the triune God. The Trinity has made footprints, but those footprints lead somewhere. Thus, creation, in addition to having a source, has a goal, a teleology, which is also found in the Trinity. To know creation's author is to know creation's goal. This is especially the case for those creatures in whom the Trinity has pressed its heaviest footprints, that is, human beings. The image means we are called to a life aimed toward our Creator as our true end. This is the whole point of the second half of On the Trinity that is slowly and arduously played out in books 8 to 15. A likeness drawn from the created world, especially found in the image, for Augustine is only ever a departure from which to consider aspects of the divine life to which we are drawn. As Augustine himself said in On the Trinity, book 14, chapter 15, this triad of the mind is not the image of God because the mind remembers and understands and loves itself, but because it is also able to remember and understand and love him by whom it was made. And when it does this, it becomes wise. Let it worship the uncreated God by whom it was created with a capacity for him and able to participate in him. The point of this, as I begin to wrap up this second large point, and at least begin to suggest my third point, is that just as consideration of the source of creation brings three questions: who, by what, and why, leading to the Father creating through the Son and in the Spirit, so do these shape our return to the Trinity in worship. The love with which we love as images is the Spirit within us. What do we love? Sapientia, knowledge of divine matters, which is the Son. This dynamic of loving and knowing is the dynamic of the image moving toward its source and goal, which is knowing and loving the Father. This love and this knowledge graced to us by the Spirit and the Son is that by which we adhere to the Father. It is the fulfilling of the dynamism of the image placed within us, that heavy footprint given to us in creation. As we saw, Augustine will even draw this out corporately, saying the heavenly city itself is founded by God, enlightened by God, and finds its happiness in God. The very character of creation enables this. The work of God in the image of God specifically stirs us up to allow us in the end to enjoy or worship God in the Spirit through the Son. We must, or we exist toward the Creator, and our towardness, if I can put it that way, follows a Trinitarian pathway. This turns out to be a natural outworking of who God is. Becoming better readers of creation is a spiritual exercise that leads us to our triune God. But in fact, becoming better readers of creation leads to becoming better readers of God, the Trinity. In Augustine, his formal Trinitarian theology teaches that the Father is the principium or source. The Son is eternally generated from the Father. And in giving the Son everything in generation, the Son receives the Spirit who proceeds from the Father and Son. This inner Trinitarian identity is then identified with his action in the world, in creation and redemption through the sending of his Son in the incarnation and the Spirit at Pentecost. In other words, the gracious missions of the Son and Spirit flow from their divine life. It is also appropriate to say these missions reveal something of divine life. Thus, when we prodigal-like awake from or awake to our image-bearing dependence and return to our Father, we follow the footsteps which take us to the divine missions, yet we follow them in reverse direction. As we do so, we retrace the very lines of the Trinity in transformational worship in the Spirit through the Son to the Father. Thus ends the reading of the paper.